Okay, so one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately is this question of mental health and how well the contemporary worldview is suited to help people understand what we mean by mental health and mental wellness. It does seem like a difficult question. You know, I think it's not a secret that many young people today are on forms of mental health drugs. That is, they're in need of antidepressants, anti anxiety drugs. Many of them need focus forms of, attention deficit corrective drugs. And I think mood altering drugs, some of it could be attributed to modern hustle bustle life and just the crazy situation that we have created for ourselves in this world. Some people would say that it's due to better diagnosing, that in the past people have perhaps always had such problems. We just haven't had both the ability to diagnose these problems and the ability to bring better solutions through chemicals for people. I think some people would say that this has to do with forms of meaninglessness, estrangement, and alienation from the loss of traditional community, loss of traditional ways of life, loss of traditional relations to the land, arguably loss of traditional religious worldviews, and including beliefs that, even if by modern scientific standards would today be seen as wholly false, they furnished people with some sense of security and a narrative of a meaningful life. And some of that now is being challenged. That we've accumulated lots of facts that have sent people kind of reeling with uncertainty and forms of anxiety. Let me see if I can sort of ease into it. It's I recently had someone tell me a story about someone who, and I was adopted and I grew up knowing I was adopted, but there was someone who was recently, and this was a neighbor who told me about a friend, whatever, who had at like 35 or something, they had discovered that they were adopted. And, it's interesting to think of how one's belief can suddenly be disclosed as wrong, as false. And so this person had, you know, and radical kind of psychological readjustment that had to go on in the wake of that. Now, you could call psychological health the ability to deal with that, or you could call the person who's able to still not be destroyed from having something like that happen. But I think there are lots of cases where this has occurred, where people's fundamental beliefs, and it's someone comes home and they get the Dear John or the Dear Jane letter where the person says, I'd never really loved you and I'm gone. Or some person, they discover that their father wasn't really their father, but it was some other person. And beliefs themselves can just be disclosed to be false, right? I think that's part of why I think some people want to say a psychological health depends upon grounding oneself in the body. Very simple things, whether it's washing the dishes and petting the dog, learning to play a musical instrument, learning to paint, learning to manually manipulate the world to produce results. Now, you can have bad technique or bad form, but none of the things that you do in the world can suddenly be disclosed as false or untrue in the way that beliefs and ideas can, right? And so I think it's not to say one has to avoid beliefs and ideas because they're just too fragile. One's going to have different strategies for, I guess, cultivating attitudes of resilience that allow for mental health in the wake of some of that rug being pulled out from under one. But I think the larger question then would be, to what extent is first person experience still valid when the rug gets pulled out from under one? So let me see if I can ease into this. When I was a young person, I was about 18 and I first injured my back, and I didn't know that it was a back injury. In fact, if someone had argued with me at the time, I would have told them they didn't know what they were talking about, and I did. I was like, no, I hurt my leg, and my leg hurt. It was, it was striking pain down my left leg, and at a certain point, it was very bad. And I had some doctors who they didn't really understand enough. Either they misheard what I said, or they took me at my word, or they gave me leg stretches, and they were trying to ease what they thought was a hamstring pull or something. And some of the things, I guess, momentarily relieved the pain, at least enough for me to go, well, very good. And various exercises and moving differently led me to believe for the while, and a good number of years, that I had leg pain and I had injured my leg in some way, that there was something wrong with my leg. And it wasn't until later, when the disc was blown and I had lost reflex and it was not a good situation, that I discovered from basically an expert that I had blown a disc, and it was in my back all along. And it was a bulged disc in the back, and it finally had shattered. And when the neurosurgeon, I'd actually had a lumbar laminectomy, and the neurosurgeon had went in there, and I stood on my own 2 feet. And after I had been bedridden for a long time and was not I was very depressed over my sort of life situation there for a while. And this guy had given me my life back. I was standing on my own 2 feet, and it convinced me beyond any doubt that the injury was in my back. And when they fixed my back, my leg is still a little odd, but the overall experience that I had was, I can't really trust my direct experience. It was that my direct experience could be false. It could be not true. Not just a belief, but my belief system wasn't the issue, but the actual physiological experience of pain. That although the pain was in the leg, it was a phantom pain because the injured part was in the back. And the scientific worldview has really ushered this in so many ways. Now, if you look, most recently, the diagnostic manual for psychological illnesses has largely abandoned anything but neurophysiological, neurochemical causes of mental illness. And it starts to become very interesting about, to what extent do belief systems even count now within the scientific worldview as precipitating forms of mental illness, or are we only to understand mental health in terms of, chemicals? If someone is unhappy, if someone has anxiety, if someone is depressed, is it because they have overdrawn expectations? Is it because the environment was bad? Or is it all just simply because the chemicals weren't right? And is a pill the fix-all, or not a pill, a medicine regimen? I mean, let's try to dignify it more. I mean, can we see that the scientific worldview ushers in this tension between what a person directly experiences, the kind of narrative that they call their life, and is there something even like having a life, the struggle to make a life, the kind of narratives that people have traditionally lived by for thousands of years, right? And it could be a narrative something like choosing between good and evil, choosing between right and wrong. Now, good and evil, right and wrong, these aren't elements on the periodic chart of the, you're not going to find them there, right? There's some scientist is going to come along and go, right, yep, look, this is good, this is evil. We might have actions that are advised, right? I don't want to say that science can't give lots and lots of data about what one, should do or what one shouldn't do. But I guess it does seem to be ambiguous when you start to get at these larger questions of the meaning of life and the kind of narratives that traditional religious frames have provided people. It cloaked people in these stories, which I guess increasingly are seen to be not only suspect, but they're seen to be irrelevant and the question of psychological health is moving away from what can a person know, how can a person learn to exercise compassion, forgiveness? How can a person learn to not look back, not to have regrets over past decisions? How can a person learn to navigate oneself and one's own issue of self-relation? And it moves away from all of that. Instead of moving toward dogma about how one needs to forgive and perhaps even oneself, one says, no, it's not a question of you having anxiety over the way that you've been treating others and yourself, or the bad conscience you've accumulated. It's all just neurophysiological, and it's neurochemical. I think this question of how will one understand psychological health in the upcoming millennium, this is something that I think really will be a major issue. I think especially to the extent that religion was a kind of primitive psychology, and as religion waned, or as it is waning, I think or at least the dogma of religion is waning. Increasingly people just can't believe in virgin births. They just can't believe in, resurrections. They can't believe in a physical entity, some creator God who has these characteristics. But I think the kinds of logic that religious explanation has provided, in the sense of a psychology from the first person's perspective of how is one to relate to others, how is one to relate to oneself, and how are there mental health and mental wellness consequences that come from how one feels about oneself, from having met or not met one's obligations. How well does one, I guess, live up to what one espouses in terms of is one a hypocrite or not? All these different things, they become less and less, I guess, part of psychology because they don't fit into the pharmaceutical regimen. And isn't there something about psychology that is still going to retain issues of belief, things that will ultimately be questionable or falsifiable, and not just a chemical check? Okay, so those are some thoughts. Thanks.